Welcome to the Dialectic by the Rajput and the Wasp. I'm Atul Singh, the Rajput.
And I am Glenn Carle, the Wasp.
Excellent. Today we are going to look at something which is very dear to Glenn's heart, and it is something that Glenn is one of the top experts in the world. And it is something that relates to a historic development event that happened 22 years ago, and then something else that happened 20 years ago. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, we will be looking at the Iraq War of 2003, and before that, to 2001 and 9/11, the attacks of September 11th, 2001 in New York and Washington, D.C., and how they changed the world. So, Glenn, what happened 22 years ago that changed the world?
Oh. Well, on September 11, 2001, it's hard for those of us who lived it and I guess really worked on it and had our lives shaped by it to realize that it's time passes quickly and that it is now ancient history, forgotten by most and not even experienced at all by every day more and more people. But on September 11, 2001, Osama bin Laden's Al-Qaeda organization um, attacked the World Trade Center towers in New York City, which were 105 stories tall or some such thing as that, and the Pentagon in Washington. And they were probably aiming at either the White House, which is my guess, or the U.S. Capitol, also in Washington. But that didn't actually succeed, that one aspect of the attack. And they flew airplanes into them, killing in total about 3,000 Americans and bringing down two 105-story buildings. Which then began what came to be called, a hideous name, but perhaps apt for its lunacy, the War on Terror.
Or the Global War on Terror, as some say.
The Global War on Terror, the GWAT, that's correct. The Global War on Terror, which we would refer to in our cables, our telegrams, and written correspondence as the GWAT. And that didn't simply shape, but it dominated U.S. policy, which therefore meant much of international relations for 15 years, about 15 years.
So, Glenn, you have a personal story. You were negotiating with the Taliban for the US, and you took then Taliban's foreign minister around New York, and you actually looked up at the World Trade Center. Recount that story again.
Yeah, I was. I can talk a little bit about this aspect of my life, or at least elusively, if not elusively. From 1997 to 2001, I handled some aspects of U.S.-Afghan interactions, which meant the Taliban. The Taliban took power from a vacuum in 1996. And so from 1997 to 2001, for various reasons, I had responsibilities for Afghanistan and human rights issues in particular. So at one point, as I recall, I don't remember the name of the gentleman, but the deputy foreign minister or assistant to the foreign minister of the Taliban came to New York, and I showed him around Manhattan. And he was a polite young man in his late 20s, I would guess. I don't think he was in his 30s even, maybe. And I showed him, the Sodom and Gomorrah of Gotham City, meaning that we walked down streets during the day, and he simply saw, the decadence all around him in his view, I think. But he was very polite, wide-eyed. We didn't go to the World Trade Towers. We were in Midtown Manhattan, around the United Nations at the time. So I did show him around. Yes, that is true.
And there is an argument that many make that the US needed to go to war after 9/11, and the US needed to go into Afghanistan. 20 years down the line, the Taliban are back in power. There are some who even now argue the US should have gone into Iraq given what it knew at the time. And of course, 20.
No, you mean Afghanistan, not Iraq.
No, I mean Iraq as well. Iran. Some argue that
Iraq,
given what they knew at the time, the US should have gone to Iraq as well. So walk us through, why did the US first go to war in Afghanistan, and why 2 years later it ended up adding Iraq to the list?
Yeah, well, the two have been combined in discussion because of history, what actually happened, into one subject or one issue. And that's tragic because it was made to be true by our actions, but otherwise was not the truth, meaning that Afghanistan, the issue of terrorism, Iraq, Saddam Hussein, really had zero to do with one another. They came to be associated in the global war on terror perspective by the United States then administration, President Bush and the neoconservatives, Republicans, because the administration, kept beating the drum that they were one and the same problem. But they actually, and was taken at the time as a political statement, but it is not. It is a factual statement. They had nothing to do with one another until we invaded and made them have to do with one another.
So why Afghanistan first?
Why did we go into Afghanistan? After the Soviets pulled out of Afghanistan in 1991 or 2, there was a vacuum, and there was a state of nature in Afghanistan. It reverted to a space, a number of overlapping tribes and societies without a government. There was a state of nature. There was anarchy. And it is true, as the Taliban asserted, that there were women being raped, and there was no rule of law. So there was essentially a civil war.
Let me very quickly, add a qualifier. I think there was never a rule of law in Afghanistan after perhaps the Soviets took over, or after Afghanistan turned communist. The rudimentary rule of law existed until they had a monarch. What happened during the days of the Civil War was chaos. There wasn't even order. I don't think they particularly had rule of law even when the Taliban took over. They had some draconian Sharia, but it wasn't exactly rule of law as we know in the West.
Oh, once the Taliban hadn't gotten that far, yeah. With their rule, there was a semblance of a state.
Yeah. It kept order, but not law.
Applying. Well, they were applying or attempting to apply the 7th century Sharia, version of Islamic law
after they took over. Before that, it was all crazy civil war.
Prior to that, there were various warlords who were their power centers being various ethnic factions, whether it was the Sunni or the Uzbek or the several
the Tajiks led by Ahmad Shah Massoud, the Uzbeks led by Rashid Dostum. Right. There were, of course, Mazar-e-Sharif was another power center, all of that. And then the Taliban sweep it into power.
So the Taliban won this struggle. Mm-hmm. We all suspect they did so with some assistance from the Pakistani intelligence service.
The Inter-Services Intelligence, the ISI.
The ISI, mm-hmm. which chose them as their proxies, their agents to extend Pakistani influence and security, because the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan has always been somewhat fictitious and existed more in the salons of London in the 1890s or 1880s than than ever in fact. So it was in Pakistan's interest, they thought. In any event, this is too much in the weeds. The Taliban took control in 1996. The U.S. policy was as follows from 1996 until September 11, 2001. And I know this because I did it. I was one of the people trying to implement, advocate, represent this policy. And our view was Afghanistan will do what Afghanistan wishes to do, and its internal affairs are its own. We have one request. Osama bin Laden sought refuge in Afghanistan in 1996 when he was expelled under U.S. pressure from Sudan because he had attempted to assassinate one of my colleagues, whom I know quite well, who was working in Sudan and was conducting terrorist operation attacks against not just the United States, Western secular and Saudi apostate uh, um, entities, whether they were people or buildings or governments and so on. So we, the United States, tried to detain or have bin Laden detained in Sudan, and President Bashir of Sudan, who was sympathetic to uh, bin Laden, refused to do so. But finally, under pressure, the pressure became too strong for him, so he had bin Laden leave. Bin Laden went to Afghanistan. The U.S. policy then for 4 years was to the Taliban, um, please render um, uh, Osama bin Laden to justice, to the United States, so that we can try him for terrorism. And I could go through a long list of terrorist attacks that Al Qaeda clearly did conduct against the United States. Al Qaeda blew up the American embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, killed other colleagues of mine, people I did know, not just colleagues because we were in the same organization, and so on. Uh, the Taliban always said, well, they essentially said no. And we continued to say, we can be a good friend to Afghanistan, with the United States, if you will surrender bin Laden so that we can try him, not kill him. We wanted to put him in the court of justice. But the Taliban always refused, and fundamentally they did so because he was an Islamic brother, and they didn't want to give him to an apostate, evil state. They did say, we'll try him in an Islamic court if you'd like in Afghanistan, and we didn't think there would be much justice served in that sort of almost certain farce. So he said no.
After all, he
Then
was fighting a jihad in his eyes, and in fact, even in theirs.
Absolutely, yeah. He was, Osama bin Laden is Saint George slaying the dragon, from Christian terms. He was, he was a hero, opposing cultural and political pollution, in his view, the end of civilization and of morality, and more importantly than that, of God's way on earth. And there were two main centers of this evil from his perspective. One was the United States and other Western states who were religiously, apostates, or not apostates, we didn't know the true way of Islam, and refused it. We were infidels.
You were Christians.
And the other was the apostate states of Saudi Arabia in particular, which was polluting the most sacred sites of Islam and perverting the religion. And so bin Laden decided that he knew the truth and would try to bring truth and justice to all by killing anyone who disagreed with him. And so that's what he was trying to do. And if you share that view, then he was acting honorably. And if you think that that's lunatic, that one person assigned to himself the authority of life and death over billions, then perhaps he wasn't so wise after all. So that was our one position, the United States' one position. I know this. This is not reductionist. I know this because I did it. And then as George Tenet, who was then the director of the CIA, said at the time, and he said it subsequently in testimony many times, all of these signs were flashing red, that Al Qaeda was going to conduct more attacks and that an attack on the United States, in the United States, was imminent. This was not a surprise to us. We knew this, but we didn't know where or when, and we tried to find out, and obviously we failed in the end to stop this attack. And then 9/11 occurred, and he had his operatives hijack 4 airplanes and fly them into buildings, killing ultimately 3,000 people. At which point, the response of the U.S. government, President Bush, was told immediately that we, the CIA, the U.S. intelligence community, and the State Department, had a very good idea as to who did it. We had no doubt, really, and we verified that our assessment was correct multiple times from multiple sources after the fact, that it was Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda. And Bush said to one of his staff members the day of the attack, well, we're going to kick some ass now, or I think that's a paraphrase, but he did say kick some ass. And he would go get the perpetrators, which is Al Qaeda. And where was Al Qaeda? Al Qaeda's headquarters, which was bin Laden's residence, was in just outside Kandahar in Afghanistan. So the United States issued an ultimatum: give us bin Laden, or we will come and take him. And the Taliban temporized and then said no. And so the United States invaded. And it was a pretty clearly justifiable act in this instance. This instance was clearly justifiable as opposed to other invasions by the U.S. or other countries that are far more
NATO invoked Article
murky.
5, and basically it was a coalition that went into Afghanistan. UK played a big role. I believe MI6 was of assistance to you chaps in Langley. So on the whole, it was quite quite a diverse set of characters. Of course, America played the leading role, but you had the Dutch, you had the Danes, you even had the Germans.
Yeah, there was near universal support. I'm not aware of just about any state that opposed the U.S. initial policy of invading Afghanistan. There were some who were quiet, perhaps, but there was not much opposition. It's true NATO invoked its Article 5, which is that an attack on one is an attack on all, and our existential security is at risk, and so we are obliged to, under treaty, our obligations to come to the aid of that country which has been attacked, and that is true. And MI6 and other countries certainly worked closely with the United States for years after the attack and before on counterterrorism issues. The invasion itself of Afghanistan was, to my knowledge, pretty much exclusively an American operation. The invasion of Iraq 2 years later was also an American operation, but there was more clear material participation by other countries. But we'll get to that.
Mm-hmm.
So the invasion of Iraq occurred. The attack on the United States was September 11. And it was about 6 weeks later, in mid-October, I forget the exact date, that the United States invaded Afghanistan. And it's one of the triumphs. You can argue about the failure of the ultimate policy years later, but the invasion itself is one of the triumphs of the CIA and U.S. Special Forces in history, because literally about 120 CIA officers and an equal number of Special Forces officers, plus a handful of aircraft from the U.S. Navy, destroyed the Taliban's army and occupied the country.
Yeah, with local help, may I add, which is why the role of the CIA was extraordinary, because the bulk of the fighting was done by the Northern Alliance, the Tajiks.
The Northern Alliance.
Yeah, in particular. Men. He had been killed on September 9th, 2 days before 9/11, by...
Ahmad Shah Massoud, to those listening, he was the head of what was called the Northern
Yeah,
Alliance. It was the only organized resistance to the Taliban's control in the Panjshir Valley, east and north of Kabul,
yeah. He's known
and
as the
which is a
Lion of
hard,
Panjshir. To our readers, they must know that he was a great military commander. He fought the Soviets. He was widely regarded as
charismatic.
the best Afghan commander. He was backed, of course, by the CIA during his days fighting the Soviets. And later, of course, even though he was dead, his men still had the organization and the fighting experience to take on the Taliban. And the US backed the Northern Alliance, backed Massoud's boys, who in any case had a score to settle. And the triumph was glorious.
Yes, now he was, as you said, he was assassinated on September
Yeah.
9 by Al Qaeda.
Yeah.
Um,
Was it the Taliban or was it Al Qaeda or was it both? I
oh,
don't
I'm
know.
pretty confident it was Al Qaeda working, sort of doing a favor
I
for
see.
the
I
Taliban,
see.
um, and part of the larger sequence or matrix of attacks that Bin Laden at that time was conducting. So September 9, they get rid of him for the Taliban, but for themselves. And September 11, they attacked the United States. And uh, now Bin Laden's objective was not just to give a bloody nose to the U.S., but he was skilled in a number of ways and seriously delusional in others. He believed that the as so many opponents of the United States have, always to their chagrin, ultimately, that the godless, infidel, incoherent, because so pluralistic and therefore disorganized seeming culture was simply hedonistic and decadent, and that a blow would, and only interested in money and pleasure, and that a blow to the heart of American capitalism, New York City, would so disrupt the American economy that the American government and civilization would start to collapse. I mean, it's really quite a lunatic thought, but one shared before Bin Laden by the likes of Hitler and others.
Even
Um,
even actually shared by the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, Hassan Banna, who was horrified by the sight of immoral American girls going dancing with boys.
Dancing in
Yeah,
Colorado.
exactly. now, now, clearly they hadn't gone to Berlin and seen women sunbathing topless. That would have horrified them further.
Oh God.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
to be fair, America is a pretty conservative country. At least those of us who've spent time in Europe and move west to America, we are horrified by the conservatism of America, where you can't even go to a bar without a fake ID until you're 21. So, far from being licentious, I mean, my view of America is it's too bloody conservative.
Yeah, well, I guess things look differently depending on where you come from.
Exactly. But then,
But
hey ho, there we go. I'm a descendant of the immoral, Rajputs, particularly on my grandmother's side, the Chandels, who built the most erotic temples in history. So I'm certainly not high on the purity spectrum.
but you had to be invaded because of that,
Yes,
because
of
of your
course,
decadence.
and civilized, which they did.
And it was
They did civilize some of us. Some of us converted.
that's yes. It was the Americans' turn, later, because we didn't exist until later. And so okay. So it truly was about 120 operatives of the CIA and the equivalent numbers in special forces. So it was a brilliant operation. It took a few weeks only to destroy the Taliban. Now, when you look at the objective correlation of forces, I mean, it's quite absurd. You have the most powerful nation in history militarily against a ragtag bunch of people who live in crags and carry Enfield rifles from 1903.
No, they
Um,
carry
okay.
AK-47s, Glenn. That's not true. I mean, they were carrying Enfield rifles earlier. Don't exaggerate. I mean,
No,
you had given them plenty of
actually,
good weapons during Soviet times.
I'm not being completely facetious because my colleagues found I didn't work on
Yeah.
the directly on the U.S.'s support to the Mujahideen against fighting the Soviets, but when the U.S. started to provide modern weapons to the Mujahideen so that they could fight the Soviets, they being my colleagues, quickly found that this was in some ways a mistake because you have to understand and exercise some fire control, meaning that a modern weapon has a magazine that can fire probably 32 bullets at a
No,
time,
AKs have
like a
30.
machine gun.
AKs have 30. 30
30,
bullets,
okay.
AK-47s and
Thir-
AK-56, if I remember correctly, from my days as an officer, because that was my choice
okay,
of weapon.
so 30 bullets, but if you have your um
If you're trigger happy, you're
you,
out of 30 very quickly, and you basically are
and
out of
then you're dead.
ammunition, and then you're
Yeah, and then you find yourself
yeah,
dead.
yeah, you're
And
Rogerly. I mean,
and
you're profoundly and irreversibly screwed, or Rogered, whatever term you want to use.
yeah, yeah, and so that happened over and over, and it was found that the Enfield was actually in some ways superior because you could, it was a very good rifle, but it only fired single shots, and you had to then recock the thing.
Yeah,
Um, but okay, that also is a little bit too much in the weeds,
yeah.
but that was sort of shocking to discover that. In any event, how do we go back to the Mujahideen? Um,
Very simple. In a few weeks of fighting, the Taliban had been vanquished. The victory had been glorious,
right.
and now
And
you were basically in control, sort of in control.
well, now we get to where tragedy begins.
Yeah.
Hubris, I would argue, later, but probably tragedy. So, what were the United States objectives in invading Afghanistan? It was to destroy Al Qaeda, destroy his refuge,
Osama bin Laden's
um,
refuge, basically.
Osama bin Laden, Osama bin Laden's refuge,
Mm-hmm.
and capture bin Laden.
Mm-hmm.
There was not much thought given to Afghanistan itself, except that the Taliban were in the way and had become clearly allies and protectors of bin Laden. President Bush was explicit that the United States would not make the error of nation building, of attempting to reform the Afghan society and create institutions. It was not our problem, and it was a road to complexity and probable disaster, or at least terrible problems, if the United States tried to do that. If any state does that, you cannot reform societies with armies. Or if you can, it takes literally multiple generations. So Bush was clear eyed and explicit about this when we invaded. But what happened is bin Laden escaped. Um, and we owned the country at that point. We had destroyed what passed for the government, and were there. And the assessment was that Al Qaeda was still present. This was very controversial in-house in the United States government, counterterrorism circles, and without. Now, my view came to be that that was a grievously erroneous and reductionist assessment. But there is a conflation, and this is a very important point for the subsequent history of the past 20 years. The neoconservatives and what came to be the dominant faction school of thought in the CIA was that the threat of jihadist terrorism from Al Qaeda in the quote global war on terror was existential and pervasive. That American and Western civilization was threatened, one, and two, that a jihadist in Morocco or a jihadist in Nigeria, a jihadist in Malaysia, and a jihadist in Afghanistan, et cetera, were all part of a global network, a coherent, hierarchical, controlled organization. This remains controversial to this day. Many fine people in counterterrorism areas continue to believe this, and it is profoundly, existentially, actually, well, not, I'll take that back, profoundly tragically wrong.
Yeah,
That is not true.
exactly, because to even assert that you could have a global organization of such a ragtag diverse bunch beggars imagination if you've traveled a wee bit, as I have. Even, for instance, the French resistance under against the Gestapo wasn't terribly organized. It's really hard to organize a resistance because by its very nature it fragments. It's like nuclear fission. So you've got lots of disparate actors who go in lots of different ways, and they can cause a lot of nuisance, but they are certainly not coherent.
Well, that's my view. And it's not just my view. I'm confident that is correct. And it's the view of, to simplify a little bit, there were two schools of thought within the U.S. intelligence community: those who felt as I just expressed and you did, and those who expressed the other view, which won the argument.
And were they neoconservatives? Were the people holding this view, were they mainly neoconservatives?
The policymakers at the top were neoconservatives, yes. Not all of the intelligence personnel were neoconservatives, but they did share this, come to share the, or actually they helped elucidate and develop that view, which comforted the views and objectives of the neoconservatives. It's actually more that way. We'll get to the motivations of the neoconservatives in a moment. They're more relevant
for Iraq.
For Iraq, although for Afghanistan too.
Yeah. So now we are in a situation.
Then the question became, well, we have Afghanistan. What happens now if we leave? The view was Al Qaeda will come back, the Taliban will be there still, and we will have solved nothing. So we have to stay. At the same time, the policy was, well, we don't do nation building. So what's the answer? In the end, there's no answer to this. You can't square that circle. But we stayed, much like happened to, frankly, the British in many parts of their empire over a couple of centuries. To leave was viewed as a defeat. To stay sort of had no point, but to show that we can continue to have suzerainty over the area. Right. And then that was it.
Yeah, so then the classic example for Britain was Palestine. They basically marched into it in a moment of triumph. General Allenby announced he had come as a pilgrim, not as a conqueror. And he
in 1916.
Yeah, and he achieved what Richard the Lionheart had failed. Basically, the Brits were in Jerusalem, finally. And after many centuries, but hey-ho, there we go, they were there, they were in charge. And very quickly, they found that they had promised two very separate things to the Arabs and the Jews. And eventually, they couldn't ride those two boats at the same time. And eventually, they left. But they left after losing a lot of people unnecessarily. And of course, we know of the Camp David bombing and a few other incidents. But it was a very painful, protracted 3-decade experience for the British. Because they weren't, gaining revenues from Israel, unlike India. So Israel was a money-losing proposition.
Well, I think for the British Empire, the only clearly profitable colony that Great Britain ever had was India.
No, South Africa was good. Diamonds and commodities. Yeah, so it isn't just India. That would not be. And India then was India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. Hong Kong was not bad. Hong Kong was profitable. It was a great port. So I think there were a few profitable places, but a lot of them were also basically being subsidized by the money coming from British India. Which was the jewel in the crown.
Were profitable before that. Yeah. In any event, we don't care about the British colonizers for the moment.
Yeah.
So the U.S. found itself with Afghanistan. What to do? So it started to nation build, to create a government that we could leave the country to, because we didn't want to be there. I mean, it's true. The U.S. didn't really want to be there, but found itself stuck. And then the Taliban never really went away, and the organic internal dynamics of Afghanistan are very relevant too. And what was Afghanistan? It's essentially it was a number of different tribal entities dominated vaguely by the Pashtuns. So it was sort of the Taliban were sort of Pashtunistan. supported by the Pakistani intelligence service, and the Pakistanis didn't want the Imperial Americans or the nasty Indians having any sort of influence
Or
in
the
what they
wily
viewed,
Iranians.
or the wily Iranians. Correct? Yes, yes, thank
Yeah,
you for mentioning that.
yeah.
In Afghanistan, and so it was in their interest, and they have this bizarre. They being the Pakistanis, what I have always viewed as well, nations have their mania
Hmm.
and delusions. Certainly, the U.S. does. They have this this strategic concept that Afghanistan can provide strategic depth
Yes.
to Pakistan against their behemoth enemy, India, which I just find crazy to imagine
Did
that
you
if there's
encounter this in your interactions with your counterparts in ISI? Did you find this fixation with strategic depth?
never they never said that to me directly.
Mm.
No,
But you
no.
saw that in their in their behavior.
Oh yes. Oh yes. Yeah. I can find no other. Well, there are the other explanations for Pakistan. Of course, wants to have a weak Afghanistan, so that it's not a threat to Afghanistan because there are border issues with
So
the
that they are not a
Pashtun,
threat to Pakistan. So,
not a
yeah,
threat to Pakistan.
Pakistan.
That's
And
correct.
there's a Durand line which no Afghanistan government has ever accepted. And they claim
Which they
territories
lay claim,
in
they being the
Pakistan.
Afghans, largely the Pashtun, to large parts of Pakistan,
Hmm.
which which would irritate the Pakistanis, and so it's their interest to have a weak Afghanistan, which they can broadly keep in check, uh, while keeping the Indians out, the Iranians out or down, the Russians out, and any other infidel out. And so that was Pakistan's game, and the Americans were in the way. Who wants the big brother there? And so they were supporting the Taliban quite clearly. And then the U.S. found itself in this low level, and then sometimes not so low level terrorist-like insurgency, really an insurgency, while trying to build up institutions that could be self-sustaining, the military, the rule of law, and so on and so forth. And that went on for uh, basically for 20 years. The U.S. got stuck there. However, we also doomed ourselves to fail. Not only was the objective probably unobtainable, but it certainly was unobtainable when within let me think. We conquered Afghanistan by the end of November, I would guess. Can't remember exactly. It took about 6 weeks, um, and then immediately, and this is I have firsthand experience in this. Immediately, the resources of the United States, intelligence and military and otherwise, were substantially withdrawn and redirected towards Iraq.
Hmm.
Um,
As early as that,
and
that is crazy to me.
Oh, no
You
question about
haven't
it.
even
Absolutely.
finished business. You've not
Absolutely.
finished business in Afghanistan, where, yes, you've kicked out Taliban, but Osama bin Laden is still alive, and you're already redirecting resources away. That's crazy to me.
It's absolutely true. Absolutely true. I can, any number of personal firsthand experiences substantiating
Mhm.
that I could reveal. And it was clear as of December 2001 that our attention was turning to Iraq. And in fact, I'll go back further. That's December 2001. In January 2001, when President Clinton left office and President Bush assumed office as President of the United States, I was working, as we have talked about, on Afghanistan. And the briefings from the intelligence community to the incoming administration were terrorism by jihadists is a real threat. And here's, they blew up the embassies here and they've killed people there, they've kidnapped them here. Osama bin Laden tried to assassinate people in Sudan, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And this is a problem that we have to pay attention to. That was the briefing by the outgoing Clinton administration, and that was accurate. And the response from the neoconservatives was, Democrats don't know how to do foreign policy. Clinton is a namby-pamby leftist. We understand true statecraft and the clash of great nations. And so, we'll take it from here. Our priorities are to develop an anti-ballistic missile system, to stop the rise of China, and to destroy Saddam Hussein. And that was it. It was clear from January 2001 on. There's no question. So I go back to December. Now, essentially a year later, after the invasion, conquest of Afghanistan, the destruction of the Taliban's control, and the eviction of Al Qaeda, and really largely its decimation. That's something that is a context that's really important to know, and that people to this day don't understand, because for 20 years there was almost 15, there's the global war on terror, fighting this quote existential unquote threat. It was my job to know what the size of Al Qaeda was, not mine alone, but that was my position. And in fact, Al Qaeda never consisted, at the time of the invasion and any time after that, of 400 to 600 people. Now, it's true, several thousands had been trained in sort of commando, techniques, and some of them were chosen for terrorist operations through Tarnak farms outside of Kandahar, Afghanistan, where bin Laden had his base. But that's not the same thing as someone who has sworn allegiance to, been brought into the organization and trained as a terrorist operative. Al Qaeda never consisted of really more than 400 to 600 people, of whom I always argued, really, and I'll make these figures up, but this is, more or less correct. 400 or 420 of them were young men with AK-47s who would shoot me or behead me. But that does not make them a terrorist, a capable operative who can do an attack like 9/11. There were probably a few dozen quote officers who could conceive, manage, and run a terrorist operation, a strike. And then there were dozens of people who they would train and designate to do this. Now, it only takes one person to kill hundreds. We found it takes one person to kill thousands. But that was out the size of Al Qaeda. It was said in congressional testimony over and over and over. Question, Mr. Intelligence Representative, often it would be the director of the CIA. In how many countries does Al Qaeda operate? And the formal position of the CIA was Al Qaeda is present in 80 countries. But that was not true. Now, that was heatedly debated, because what is a member of Al Qaeda? As I say, there were different views on this. But the true answer was that Al Qaeda was present, true Al Qaeda, not just jihadists who are dangerous and whom we should stop, but not the same thing as a member of Al Qaeda. Al Qaeda was present in 6 countries, not 80. Afghanistan, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Tanzania, that's 4. Gosh, I'm losing my train of thoughts now. And there are 2 other countries, which slipped my mind for the moment. That's it. So, in any event, the U.S. found itself stuck with Afghanistan in a low to mid-level insurgency, which is a terrible problem, but not a series of operations by Al Qaeda, which was our stated objective in going there. And our resources and attention were diverted under President Bush instantaneously, really, within weeks, from Afghanistan to Iraq. And then 18 months, 15 months later, after the end of the military segment of the Afghan invasion, the United States invaded Iraq.
So, walk me through how that happens. You go into Afghanistan, you haven't finished your job, and suddenly now you are invading Iraq, which is ruled by Ba'athist Saddam Hussein, who was fundamentally not a wonderful, lovey-dovey character. He's been gassing Kurds, he's been using chemical weapons against Marsh Arabs, the Shia Arabs in the south of the country, who has in the past invaded Kuwait, but who's fundamentally a socialist, and he's a Ba'athist, and Al-Qaeda, which is hardline Sunni fundamentalist, views him as an enemy, and more importantly, he views them as a mortal enemy, and he's been locking them up, torturing them, and doing things to them that the US cannot even conceive of. So how do you go from squaring that circle, meaning, conflating Osama bin Laden, who's basically an enemy of Saddam, as a friend and ally of Saddam? And how do you make the argument that he's piling up weapons of mass destruction to destroy the US?
It's important to well, keep in mind, but to be aware, to know, I guess what I should say, it's important to know that the conception of terrorism up to 9/11 was dominated for years by the concern about, quote, state-based terrorism.
Ah, understood.
Now, the PLO is not a state, but it is an organization claiming to represent a state.
Just so that our
And
listeners know, the younger ones in particular, and we've been chided by some of them not to assume knowledge, the PLO was the Palestinian Liberation Organization led by Yasser Arafat, also nominally socialist, and the Palestinian Liberation Organization used terror as a means or as an instrument of policy to fight what they saw as Israeli occupation of their ancestral land.
And not only the Palestinians, but Libya under Muammar Gaddafi from the 1970s up to about the year 2000. It would have been 2005 or so, 2004, 2005. Conducted terrorist operations. Now, Libya is a state. The terrorist operations were conducted by or at the behest of the Libyan intelligence organization and government.
Well,
The
Pakistan
Libyans
did that too. I mean, sorry, carry on. Finish your point about Libya, and
well,
then I'll
important,
get to Pakistan.
Yes. Yeah. Well, the Libyans, because not to get too much into history, but the United States and Libya were quite hostile to each other. Libya was nationalized the oil industry. This is an old post-colonial issue that irritated the West, and then Gaddafi, the leader of Libya, threatened the U.S. in a number of ways. I experienced this when I was working in Africa in the early 1980s, and thousands of miles away from Libya. The Libyans set off a bomb in a disco in Berlin where American service personnel were known to frequent. At the time, there were 330,000 U.S. soldiers in Western Europe because of the Cold War to oppose the potential invasion of Western Europe by the Soviet Union. So they killed American servicemen. The response by President Reagan then was to bomb Tripoli and nearly to kill bin Laden, not bin Laden, I'm saying, Muammar Gaddafi.
Yeah.
Gaddafi, and actually did kill one of his children, an infant, but missed him. So there were tensions. And the important point in this context is that state-based terrorism was the paradigm, the way of conceiving of terrorism by the United States and most people who were, quote, terrorist watchers at the time. So Al-Qaeda, however, is not a state. And this framework also is strongly influenced by America's support for Israel, which was a victim of repeated state-based terrorist operations, whether it was from the PLO or from sympathizers and hostile players, hostile entities, hostile to Israel.
Yeah, on
including
that
Iran.
note, two examples: 1976, the Munich Olympics, when Palestinian terrorists killed a lot of
1972, 72.
Yes, sorry, 72, not 76. I stand corrected. 76 was Moscow. So 76 was
Montreal.
No, 76 was Montreal. Yeah, exactly. So 19.
Yeah.
So 19 Munich Olympics. And in the Munich Olympics, basically, Palestinians, terrorists took a lot of Israeli athletes hostage and killed them. It was a tragic incident. And then, of course, 6 years later, there was the bombing in Beirut, which was a massive blow to the Americans. And that was, of course, inspired by Iran. I think Hezbollah carried it out. Hezbollah
That's correct.
announced its arrival at the global stage. So
Yes.
we had incidents like that in the past. Ipso facto, of course, the view of state-sponsored terrorism ran high. And those of us who come from India know very well that in the 1980s, just as the US was funding the Afghan jihad, some of that money was going in to fund terrorism in India because the Pakistanis had lost in 1971. They had lost in the India-Pakistan war that led to the creation of Bangladesh, which was East Pakistan. And after that, the dictator, General Ziaul Haq, swore, or rather launched Operation Tupac to bleed India through 1,000 cuts. So first, which is the Pakistani intelligence folks, the ISI, sponsored, funded, basically, and supported an insurgency in Punjab for the Khalistan. And then, of course, Kashmir blew up in 1989. So this state-sponsored terrorism had been around for a while.
And the incidents sounds too mild. While the events that you touch upon in India and Pakistan were occurring, I was starting my career in the early mid '80s, and my first assignment, my first day after I took the oath for various reasons, I was assigned to what was then the Lebanon issues, Lebanon desk. And at that time, in the early mid '80s, Hezbollah in particular, which is a proxy for Iran, the revolutionary regime of Iran, which is considered the United States the Shaitan Bazorg, which means the great Satan, was kidnapping Americans resident in Beirut because Beirut had collapsed, Lebanon had collapsed into civil war after Israel invaded in 1982. Now, Israel invaded because the Palestine Liberation Organization was attacking Israel and was based at that time in Lebanon. So the invasion essentially destroyed the Lebanese government and threw the country into a civil war among the Christian faction, the Sunni, and the Shia. And the Shia came to be led by, represented by Hezbollah. And Hezbollah was supported and created by Iran. And Iran has always been quite hostile to the infidel Jew and hostile to Israel, and used Hezbollah to attack it.
Since
Hezbollah,
1979, since they had the revolution, the
yeah,
Islamic revolution.
the
Yeah,
Iranian Revolution was in '79.
exactly. And just one quick thing, it's this pattern of kidnappings continues. Daniel Pearl was killed in Pakistan.
Right.
And of course, 2 years before 9/11 in 1999, a plane was hijacked from India, taken to Kandahar, surrounded by the Taliban. And India basically went down on its knees and handed over 3 terrorists who started 3 phenomenal terrorist organizations, including the ones who ended up beheading Daniel Pearl. And so terrorism, whether it is in Lebanon or whether it is Afghanistan, the Taliban, had been going around for a while.
So this was state-based terrorism, and that was the framework that the U.S. viewed this, from which the U.S. viewed terrorism in general. Let's jump ahead again to Saddam Hussein.
Yeah.
Saddam Hussein was hostile to, as I think, without exception, Arab Muslim leaders and states were to Israel, and was denounced by the United States as a state sponsor of terrorism. Now, the facts are, again, as always, controversial and disputed. However, it is true that Saddam Hussein did 2 things. He allowed a jihadist Al Qaeda sympathetic group to exist in the north of Iraq. But in fact, it was an area of Iraq beyond Saddam Hussein's control. This is after the U.S. liberation of Kuwait, and it was part of northern Iraq that Saddam never reestablished
So
control over.
that's
So that's
basically
one.
Kurdish territory. So that group was in Kurdish
Yes.
controlled territory
Well, not nominally Kurdish control, but sort of beyond the Kurds' control
as well. So it
also,
was a no
this
man's
part.
land, whereas this
Right,
group sort of prospered when neither the
right,
Kurds nor Saddam's forces had control.
correct. Near Iran. And the other incident was of a terrorist attack against Israel that occurred from Iraq by a group that was, I think it was a Hezbollah faction that Saddam allowed to conduct this operation for. Uh, but that's it. I have no brief to defend Saddam Hussein, who was a hideous monster. Uh, but those were the instances of state-based terrorism from Iraq. The neoconservatives in the United States, their view, what were their objectives? What was their view? First, their view and their objectives. They were strongly supportive of Israel. They characterized Israel as an aircraft carrier in the Middle East. The only, it's true, the only democracy in the Middle East, sharing Western values and a critical ally and a moral obligation to protect Israel from the neoconservative perspective. It opposes anti-Western pressures, Iran, jihadists, statists, like Gaddafi or Saddam, uh, and any Soviet influence that or Russian influence that would extend its sway into the Middle East, and um, so that's we had to support Israel from the neo-conservative perspective, and there are moral reasons and so on and so forth also. Thus, the state sponsor of terrorism which had snubbed its nose at the West even after at the United States, even after the uh, liberation of Kuwait in 1990 in the first Gulf War, um, was viewed as hostile. Now, it is true, I worked on Iraqi issues at the time, and after the invasion, it was also believed and established, it is absolutely certain, that Saddam Hussein was working on a nuclear weapons program, did have biological weapons programs and chemical weapons programs, which were then broadly termed weapons of mass destruction. And the fear was if he gets a, nuclear weapon or a biological weapon, he will use it against Israel. And we cannot allow this to happen. And he may share it, the view was, with state-based terrorist organizations. Uh, Probably not true, but that was sincerely believed. Now, I know for a fact that, so there were 18 resolutions passed in the United Nations of sanctions and obligations for Saddam Hussein's Iraq to follow in allowing inspectors to verify that he was no longer pursuing nuclear weapons, in 1981, the Israelis bombed a nuclear facility in Iraq to stop his nuclear weapons program. So there was substance to the concerns and the fears. And Saddam flouted after the invasion of Kuwait and its liberation by the United States in 1990. He flouted in the next 5 years 18 UN resolutions and wasn't really forthcoming. I had my office floor filled with files of Iraqi weapons programs and inspections and their cheating and trying to hide things. So there was no question that he was not doing what the Western community thought. So this is another fear by the neoconservatives, and not only neoconservatives, about Saddam Hussein, that if allowed to continue ignoring UN sanctions and obligations, that we would find ourselves with a very dangerous man with a nuclear weapon. And that was a real fear. And one that I shared. I saw the inspection reports and considered it to be a well-founded concern. And then there was a neoconservative view, which is that he was a state-based terrorist, which was not true. Then the neoconservatives also thought, and this is more controversial because they will often will deny it, but I think this is substantially accurate. The United States was experiencing the beginning of its, well, it was in the middle of its unipolar moment, and had an opportunity to reorganize the Middle East in its image, so it imagined. And there was, as Atul, you'll probably know better than I in some ways because you aren't American and you will have experienced the American obsessions from without. This historic view that America has a mission to bring democracy and the American way of life to the benighted peoples of the world, who are by definition anyone who's not American.
Yeah, I mean,
And
I get Americans preaching to me as to how democracy could improve in India. And my response generally is to play Madonna, Papa Don't Preach, because democracy, by its very nature, as we discussed in our very first podcast, is fragile anywhere in the world and is imperfect. And in some ways, Indian democracy is far more robust than American democracy. We have a lower caste prime minister and a woman who comes from one of the forest dwelling Adivasi tribes, meaning tribes that are called the scheduled tribes. So, the point is, India is a different society, and Indian democratization is naturally extraordinarily messy if you apply the Western lens. But it is a model that Indians will come up over decades, perhaps even centuries by themselves. They cannot function as two American specifications. They cannot simply dance to someone else's tune, particularly given their colonial background. They're very touchy about that. And Americans don't understand that at all. I mean, you see it repeatedly in Washington, D.C. circles.
so there was a desire, or one of the objectives was by the neoconservatives who were pushing to invade Iraq. Well, we can reorganize the Middle East so that Israel is forever secure, U.S. interests are forever predominant. Iran, I haven't even mentioned Iran in the Iraqi context. Iran is the historic, or at least recent, enemy of Iraq because there had been a terrible, terrible
Iran-Iraq
Iran
war,
war,
8 years, 1980 to 1988, which was horrific.
hundreds of thousands of people killed.
Horrific.
This was a view, well, we can deal a blow against Iran by destroying Saddam Hussein. Now, that's a lunatic assessment and the exact opposite of what, in fact, occurred.
I mean, it's interesting because, of course, coming from India, when I first heard that argument by some American Rhodes scholars, I was flabbergasted. In fact, I remember telling them they had to read a basic world history textbook. The level of ignorance was extraordinary. It was stratospheric.
Well, many people who are far more knowledgeable and expert on the Middle East than I argue, but I too share the view, which is that Saddam Hussein was a terrible person and leader and criminal in many ways, but objectively he was the most secular leader, perhaps with King Hussein, most secular
King
leader,
Hussein of
which is something
Jordan,
you can't,
just for our listeners,
of
so
Jordan,
that they know that.
in the Middle East, and the most powerful opponent of Iranian expansion in the Middle East. So destroying Saddam Hussein would not seem to be a wise step to take if the primary objective is constraining Iran.
Yeah.
But that was sort of part of the rationale. And then there was the view, which is that we liberated Kuwait because it had been invaded and destroyed by Saddam Hussein, in part because that's a terrible thing to do to a sovereign state, and in part because we didn't want any hostile party to control the preponderance of oil production.
Yeah, the Kuwaiti oil fields. You didn't want a hostile power to control that.
Right, or the Persian Gulf. And so, for all of those reasons, the neoconservatives thought, well, this is our divine destiny and mission is we must eliminate this evil man, and he was an evil man.
So
And
hang on
there's
a
another
minute.
element
Let's
which is
summarize the
controversial.
arguments. Hang on a minute. Let's summarize the arguments. There is the weapons of mass destruction argument that, number one, Saddam had WMD, as they are called, weapons of mass destruction, and he could unleash it against the West in general and the US in particular. Number two, there was the democracy agenda of the neoconservatives that we will get rid of Saddam, and this is at the height of the unipolar moment, and we will recreate the Middle East in our image. So Israel will no longer be the only democracy in the Middle East, there'll be another democracy.
Peace, justice, and democracy for all.
Exactly. We'll all sing Kumbaya. Number three, by getting rid of Saddam, we will be able to send a signal to Iran. So they abandon the balance of power policy of the likes of Henry Kissinger, and they go for this lunatic idea that Iran, after seeing Saddam chopped off or basically unseated from his throne, will then play ball. There'll be the deterrence argument. This will deter Iran. And number four, of course, is that we liberated Kuwait, and we did so because Iraq was egregious in attacking it, and Iraq is a hostile power in the Persian Gulf, and we will get rid of Iraq. So we will destroy the disease through chemotherapy, and we will then have security and energy security. So these are the four separate arguments.
That's pretty much it, with one other, which was never stated.
Oh, there's a
is
fifth
controversial.
one. Wow. Okay.
Well, some people think I never personally sensed any of this, although I wasn't remotely a senior enough position to have any sense about it at all. Some people thought that President Bush, the son of President Bush from father, in
President George Herbert Walker Bush, the father, the retired CIA director,
1988 to 1992.
Yeah.
That because Saddam Hussein, something I didn't mention, Saddam Hussein tried to assassinate President Bush in retribution for the first Gulf War, which evicted the United States, evicted Iraq from Kuwait. That President Bush just viewed Saddam correctly as an absolutely horrible human being who needed to be punished for doing terrible things, like trying to assassinate my father.
So the fifth argument is the vendetta argument.
Too.
The fifth argument is the vendetta argument, the Sicilian argument.
Well, bringing justice to a criminal, which was, there's truth to that.
So justice argument.
But those are the motivations, and
so do the Sicilians. They want justice too. You turn to to the mafia boss because on his daughter's wedding day because you want justice and the courts don't deliver it.
And then there's hubris, feeling that the United States can do whatever it sets its mind to do, and certainly from a military perspective, that remains. But certainly in 2003 was the case. There was no combination of other states could rival the United States alone if it set its mind to do something militarily, and it was absolutely true. And thus. And then there was the true belief, which was, I'm afraid, literally delusional, that Saddam Hussein was part of Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda's global war on terror. But that is literally absolutely not true. Not true, but believed. And thus, within weeks, I knew from December 2001 on that their priorities were refocused, as did all of my colleagues, and that we were marching to a whole different war.
I see. So, Glenn, we've already gone past the hour, and we haven't even gone into the consequences of what happened, which we shall do that in our next podcast, so that listeners can come back and listen to you to unravel the tapestry as to what transpired. But from what you're saying is that the United States ended up becoming a prisoner of its own imaginations, of its own hallucinations, of its own paranoia, a bit like the McCarthy years, and it imagined shadows where there were none, and it ended up squandering a lot of blood and treasure on threats that were not existential threats for the US.
No, this is one of the terrible things. I have never said that there was no threat to parry. There were. I've lost colleagues. There are individuals and organizations seeking to cause harm to American individuals and America as a country,
Mm-hmm.
and they need to be stopped. There's
Mm-hmm.
absolutely no question about that. But um, that should have been done, as it was, frankly, prior to the attack of 9/11, by dedicated professional counterterrorism officers in the U.S. intelligence community and armed services and law
So
enforcement.
special operations and intelligence
That's right.
officers
Not
working in
by
tandem.
not by all of the resources of the U.S. military, intelligence, law enforcement, and civil state, um,
Mm.
and to the tune of $8 trillion instead of the millions it costs to operate counterterrorist operations
So
against
using a
400 to 600 people.
scalpel, to give an analogy, using a scalpel instead of a hammer.
And then this, maybe we can conclude on this point because it sort of segues from how did this happen or why to what are the consequences.
The why ties in with the consequences that happened. And our listeners should remember that 2001 is the year when the Taliban attacks the Twin Towers in New York and the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., and the global war on terror begins. But it is also the year China joins the World Trade Organization. And so 2001 is a very fateful year, and what transpires in the 20 years after, in the 20 years that follow, is historic. And we will be going into the consequences of America's intervention in Afghanistan and its invasion of Iraq and all that followed, and how it created the world we live in today next time. So until then, from the Rajput and the Wasp, it is bye for now.
Talk to you soon.